Ray, we're standing in a cemetery here. What is the name of this cemetery?
Emmanuel Lair Cemetery.
And what is the importance of this cemetery to you?
Uh, there's quite a lot of family members that were buried here over the many, many years, and my grandfather's here, my parents is here, uncles and aunts and sister-in-law and things like that. So it has a lot of history for our family, and so it's a special spot here on the prairie.
And who are we going to visit today? Who are we going to start with your grandparents?
My grandparents, they came here in 1889 and settled in the area about from where we're standing, about 4 miles northeast, and put up a farm. Upon arrival that spring, it's my understanding they turned their wagon box upside down, broke some sod so they could raise some crop and things like that, and after they were done with that for the season, they started to build a sod structure, and that was a combination house and barn. And the reason the combination is so they could benefit from the animal heat during the severely cold winters here. That's part of the Dakotas. And so when you think in terms of their lifestyle and what we're experiencing today, it's an amazing contrast. And I guess I've always said we owe a lot to the ancestors who had the bravery, the courage, the strength, the stamina to launch out and to do what they did, and consequently we're able to enjoy a pretty neat lifestyle out here on the prairies. And directly behind me, my parents are buried, and my dad lived on the home place, and until about 4 years before the time of his death, he got to be 95 and a half years old and spent about 91 of those on the original homestead that his father established. And now my brother and his family live on that same place, and so it's continued on for generations. And there is a cluster of Erbeles that had homesteaded and put up farms and in that same area, and so there's a very rich family heritage in this area for those that for those of us that survived and stayed and love where we're at.
And what kind of memories do you have of your grandparents? What were they like?
Gentle-spirited, kind-hearted, a determination that is just absolutely amazing when you think of the hard times and the fact that there were no modern convenience as we know them today, no electricity and no telephone, none of the high-tech things, and it's difficult sometimes to even imagine what life was like. And so, yeah, they were very determined and and yet through all of that, very gentle-spirited. And Christianity was a very big part of their life, and I think it was their deeply rooted faith that probably brought them through all the hard times, and that has been propagated and perpetuated through the generations, and today our family holds those values in very high regard as well.
Do you have a favorite memory of your grandparents?
Oh gosh, there's their ability to do things with their hands and to be creative in their thoughts, and to when something needed to be done, whether you had the wherewithal to do it or not, that was beside the point. You did the best you could with what you had, I guess, is the key thing that sticks out in my mind.
And was it your grandparents that came over from Russia?
Yeah, back in 1889, they settled in the area here, and
Do you know
yeah.
where in Russia they were from?
Teplitz, I believe, was the place where they originally came from.
Would they ever talk about their home country at all?
Well, I think in some of them obviously left that part of the world, as we all know, is seeking a better way of life, and so for the most part, after they got here and life was so much better for them, I think, as all of us and our human tendency is to talk about the good times rather than reflect on the bad times. And I think, yeah, there were times conversation would be shared about that, but for the most part, it was always a reflection on the good times and the courageous things and how they were rewarded for it.
And what kind of traditions did they pass down to your family for your family?
Oh, goodness, a lot of things, I think. One of which is even carried on in our generation today is a lot of the foods.
And can you explain some of those for us?
Well, I think we're very high on pastries and doughs and the strudels and noodles and you name it, sausages and all of the things that were a part of the German tradition were brought into this country, and a lot of its exists and survives in this area to this day.
Now, would your family butcher their own animals to make the
Yes,
sausage?
absolutely.
And what was that like?
Well, it was a big day because, from the actual harvesting process to the actual processing of that had to take place about all on the same day. And we usually did it in the winter months because then we just had a built-in refrigerator wherever we wanted to put the meat. It was going to keep, and a lot of it was put into crocks, a lot of it was put into sausage and canning and things like that. So the whole animal would be processed about in one day's time, and relatives and or neighbors would come over and help with that process. And actually, as time went on, it was a day that I think a lot of people looked forward to because there was a lot of social activity and a lot of interaction and a lot of good times that were associated with that. And
Were you pretty close with the rest of your family?
very close, yeah.
Do you have a lot of aunts and uncles?
Very close by, and there was a lot of interaction with different farm activities where an extra hand was needed. We worked back and forth an awful lot, and of course nowadays we're much more independent and do our own thing, and of course we live in a different world where that extra hand a lot of times is not needed. And so.
And what was farm life like back when you were growing up?
It was very difficult. There was a lot of manual labor. I have very vivid memories of milking cows by hand. I have very vivid memories of cleaning the barn by hand, cleaning calf pens by hand, and just a lot of manual labor. And when we got a tractor with a loader and started feeding cattle with a tractor and a loader, even though it didn't have a cab, we thought it just can't get much better than this. And so, the physical part of it, there were a lot of difficult days. And I remember as a high school boy being in basketball and things like that, we were conditioned and ready to go before we even got there.
Is that just typical for farm kids?
Yeah, we were all kind of on the same page as far as that. We were all expected to pick rocks by hand and pitch hay by hand, and
Did your family have a lot of crops then?
We were probably, through this area, we're very diversified. We had, our main income would be crop and livestock, and probably at that time split down the middle.
Okay. Did you help a lot in the fields then as well?
Yeah, we were doing things, farm-related things with horses, and then, the onset of tractors in the late 40s and so on. I remember learning to drive a little Model A International tractor at probably age 6, and we were very involved in what was going on.
So would that be one of your earliest memories, is driving a Model A tractor?
That's right, yeah. And I thought I was a big shot then.
And over the years, what did you see with the machinery? How did that change?
Well, it seemed after we got beyond the 50s and got into the 60s, then, we were thinking in terms of hydraulics, and, from the 60s on, changes really came fast, and the process changed awful quick. The prices changed, the conveniences changed, the tractors started having power steering and the hydraulics and things like that, and my dad would always shake his head and kind of wonder how this was all supposed to work, because these tractors then were starting to cost over $2,000, and it was overwhelming to him after having come through the era of doing things with horses and so on. And but over time, as older equipment wore out, you were almost forced into buying the newer, and consequently we were able to probably cover more acres, do more things, and we're gradually able to kind of work our way up the ladder, so to speak, one rung at a time. And So it was, yeah, I guess I'm not an old person by any means, but over the time that I have lived here, when I think of what I started to drive and what we're driving today, it's absolutely overwhelming. And you have to kind of stop and think once in a while about the progress that we have made with equipment and how much easier it has made life. And I remember my dad, when he was in the home, there was an article in the Successful Farmer magazine about auto steer and tractors, and his eyesight wasn't very good, but he had a magnifying glass, and I had him read that article. And next time I stopped by, I said, "Did you have a chance to read that article?" And he said, "I did, but it's sure something you'll never see." And today our four-wheel drive tractor has auto steer, and we have air seeders and things like that, and it's amazing. There isn't a human being on earth that can drive as straight as the auto steer will provide. And so when you compare that to where we started and where we're at today, you have to pinch yourself once in a while to think that that all happened in our lifetime. And
Was that something your father would often talk about, the changes that occurred during his
absolutely,
lifetime?
yeah. He learned when he started farming, if you could break a team of horses and mend horse harness and do those kind of things, you were going to be on your road to success. And of course, before he quit farming, he was working with hydrostatics and hydraulics and power steerings and a completely different world than what seemed important to him when he started farming. And so, yeah, it's thank God for memories, because it's very unique about what really has happened in time.
And what kind of man was your father?
He was a little guy, but he was packed with enthusiasm and determination, and he was gentle-spirited. He was a man of his word. He had great family values and was concerned about our position in life and our success, and that we get an education. And he only ever had the opportunity to have a sixth grade education, but he provided a means for us to be able to go to college and things like that. And so we're grateful for that, because without that, I think life would be different for us today. And so, yeah, my parents were exceptionally good parents.
They wanted you to excel.
Yep.
Apparently.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, how about your mother? What kind of woman was she?
She was, my dad was a short little fella. My mom was tall, and I guess I'm the smallest of the boys, and I'm 6'1", and she would spend just hours and hours with doing the daily routine chores, and she was a fast-paced person where she could milk cows, have a garden, do all of the canning, and as far as buying a lot of the foods, I remember that just was not part of what you saw in her pantry. It was canned goods, it was canned chicken, it was canned garden goods, and potatoes that would last us for a year, and very hardworking, very efficient, and run a very good household, and a very kind, loving person, and was always concerned about our needs and our well-being over hers. So, yeah, good mom.
Was she the kind of woman that would help out in the fields as well as do everything inside the house as well?
No, she was pretty much taking care of the household things, the garden things, kind of the family type responsibilities to see that there was food and things like that available at all times, and the pantry was full.
And how many siblings did you have?
I have 2 brothers and a sister.
So she kept pretty good tabs on you.
Oh yeah, yeah.
What kind of stories can you tell us about growing up with your siblings?
Oh, we had a lot of fun growing up. I have an older brother that is 2 years older than I am, and I have a sister that she's the oldest in the family. And because she was the oldest in the family, and if Mom was out in the garden or something and we weren't quite behaving the way we should, she took charge, and sometimes she even involved the kitchen broom to keep us in line.
Was that pretty frequent?
Well, not frequent, but when it happened, it wasn't a good experience. With my brothers, the younger brother is 7 years younger than I am, so the troublemaking was with my older brother, I guess. We would do different things when parents were gone, as young boys would, and we had a lot of fun times. Nothing real drastic, but We actually got to the point once in a while where chickens weren't my favorite thing or his, but I actually shot some chickens once in a while when they were gone to remove them from the premises. And so I have that on my conscience.
Would you get in trouble for that?
Well, I remember my mom saying to my dad one morning when we were having breakfast, she said, "John, I don't know, I think there's either a fox or a skunk getting into our hen house and taking some chickens." And we knew after that that we need to kind of throttle back on that kind of thing.
Didn't know she was keeping that good of tabs
No,
on the
right.
chickens. Now, was it up to you kids to go out and get the chickens and such for your mother?
Yeah, we had to gather eggs and see that they had the feed for the day and clean the hen house occasionally. And I guess to this day I hate and despise chicken because of that there. And butchering chickens, that was not a good experience for me, and
What was that like for you?
I hated every minute of it.
What was the process for you?
Well, you know, we had to catch the chickens, and then of course the process would be, putting it bluntly, Dad would chop their heads off, and then, you know, the process of removing the feathers and putting them in boiling water and dealing with the wet feathers afterwards and taking care of all of the things. Just a bad deal for me, and I just could never ever have any kind of a tender spot for chicken in my life because of those experiences.
You were traumatized by the chickens.
I was, yep.
And you and your siblings, would you do anything fun outside for games or?
We had to create our own. Yeah, we would. We had a basketball on a pole and a basketball hoop, I should say, and we'd play our own basketball and things like that. And we'd have to create our own recreation. And we had our own horses, and we'd go do a lot of riding in the hills and things like that on Sunday afternoons. And yeah, a lot of good memories of what was.
Now, your parents are here as well as some other family members here in the cemetery. Who else is here?
I have a sister-in-law that was placed here a year ago this past March. She had the misfortune of developing an incurable brain tumor, and I believe she was 62 years old when she passed away. And there are uncles and aunts around here as well. Next to my grandparents' grave is an uncle and aunt that spent nearly 30 years in Africa as missionaries, and they also are buried here, as well as other uncles and aunts. Uncle and aunt that were neighbors of ours just half a mile to the north, Martin and Ida Erbele, are also buried here, as well as, you know, other relatives. And
now, you mentioned that your aunt and uncle were missionaries. Obviously, religion played a large part in in growing up here. What was church like for you when you were growing up?
oh, it was. I remember a church back as a little boy was German. The service was German. The singing was German and things like that. And it was, how would we say it, a very fundamental type religion. That there was not a lot of frills about this or that interpretation of the Bible. It was what the Bible said is how we were expected to live. And so it was, I would classify it as being fundamental and stuck to the basic truths. And I think because of that, there always seemed to be an extra flair of unity and harmony within the family and also within the community, because a lot of people abided by those principles that were taught in the church, and carries on to this day. And I think if you were going to walk into any of the churches in this area in small town USA, I think you'd still find a flair of conservatism and fundamentalism that you probably wouldn't find in the more larger urbanized metropolitan areas. It's been a very important and fundamental thing to our family heritage.
Now, were there a lot of youth activities involved in the church?
Really, there weren't, because, you know, the mode of transportation and getting around back then, and the amount of hands and labor needed, it was the basic fundamental things that took place on Sunday morning. And obviously the Sunday school and the worship service were the two things that we're focused on. And I guess when we reflect back and be honest about it, maybe we might have missed something by not having, the youth activity during the course of the week. But in truth, if you stuck to the fundamentals that you learned on Sunday morning, you were still okay. So.
And what about church meals? Did they ever have community meals at the church or anything like that?
I don't recall a lot of that in my early life. Later on, when this church closed, that was positioned right behind where we're standing, and then we went to church in town at Streeter. Then there was a lot more of potluck type meals and different social type functions, and a lot more interaction with the people of the church than there was out here in the country. And of course, over time, roads and vehicles developed and changed to where that became a much more viable thing for us to do.
So as youth, what would you do for fun? Would you go to town, or would you stay out here in the country and find something to do?
Oh, we probably spent most of our time out here in the country. However, we were typical teens when we were able to drive our vehicles and had driver's license and things like that, and went to high school and things like that. We wanted to be like every other normal teenager. We wanted to get where the action was, and so we usually had responsibilities in church on Sunday night, but after that we would interact with other teens and have a good time.
So what were dating practices like when you were growing up?
Very interesting. It was real. My parents were always concerned that, we dated girls that were of the same religion, That's a German fundamental, I guess, that you stay in the fence, so to speak, if you're a Protestant, you marry a Protestant. If you're Catholic, you marry a Catholic. And I guess over the years, that's all moderated and changed and challenged. I know some parents have challenged that and prefer that their sons and daughters still marry of the same religion, but I don't think it's nearly an issue like it was in times past. And the dating, I suppose it was a huge evening if you would go to a movie and then go out to eat somewhere or whatever. And when I think of what that cost in comparison to what it is today, it's just unbelievable. If you left home with $5 in your pocket, that was probably good for 2 nights on the town, and be a big spender if you had it spent in 2 nights. And so times have really changed in that regard.
So would that involve going to movies, or
Yeah.
what would that involve?
Yeah, we'd go to movies. There was a movie theater in a local town just east of Streeter. Gackle had a movie theater, and I suppose most of the time when we went to the movie, it was in Gackle. And once in a while, we'd really plunge and go to Jamestown to a drive-in theater, and that was big stuff. And so that was all fun. Lots of good memories about that. And
did you have a favorite movie?
Oh, I was always kind of leaning towards the Western type movie. Back in those days, John Wayne, of course, was the big hero, and actually got in on some Roy Rogers type stuff. And, over time, of course, that has all changed as your knowledge and your desires and your education leads you to think broader and differently, that there are other things besides that. So.
Now, Ray, these are your parents, your grandparents.
These are the grandparents, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And anything that you remember that was kind of fun about your grandparents?
Well, as you can see by the dates, I wasn't born when my grandma passed away, and I was very, very young when my grandfather passed away, and so we didn't have a lot of, interaction in that regard. But as it is always with grandparents back then, that there weren't retirement homes or things like that, so I remember after my grandfather passed away, how many years after that, and my grandma for that matter, was talked about and part of family conversation at holiday gatherings and what have you, and their values and what their goals and objectives were. And so you just carry that in your heart and in your spirit, knowing that and that they both were very outstanding people in the community.
And did they die naturally, or was it a disease, or?
My grandfather died naturally, and I think my grandmother had surgery and developed a blood clot and never overcame that. And of course, when you look at the medical world today, as to back in, well, I'm not even sure what her date of death is, but I think it was back in the 30s, you know, that the medical world wasn't what it is today. And I think ultimately, cause of death was a blood clot.